Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Nice to see after 5 days of this, there's still a lot of conversation and activity going on here. So I'm Jim Case, the Chief Terminologist for SNOMED International, and I'm pleased to be able to welcome you to the James Reed Memorial Lecture. The lecture itself has been in place for a number of years, honoring James Reed, who was one of the foundations of the application of clinical terminology. And so we're very happy to honor his memory as well as the future of terminology as we start to talk about the continued development of SNOMED. And so what I would like to do now, before we get started, is to invite Carol McCumber from Clinical Architecture up to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning. Welcome to the James Reed Memorial Lecture. As a sponsor, it is my honor on behalf of Clinical Architecture to welcome you. To be honest, post the awards gala, I was very tempted to go the ChatGPT route and to summarize all of Keith's contributions to SNOMED and informatics and terminology in general. But I think Guillermo and Jim did a fantastic job, so I'm taking the exact opposite route. So I apologize in advance for that, as ChatGPT likely would have done much better of a job, probably more accurate, superfluous, without the corny personal jokes. But to me, I felt that to do it justice, I should make it as personable as possible. So stick with me. I promise I'll get there and make all the connections. 20 plus years ago, when I started in informatics, straight out of graduate school with a degree in biomedical engineering, focusing on biocompatibility of electrochemical sensor materials. I was, ready to take on the world. I know I had a lot of potential. My advisors are surely wondering what I'm doing here, talking about terminology. But fate would have it, into terminology I went. Not long after, I was given the opportunity to start participating in standards via HL7 and SNOMED. So it's a very special moment for me. I know this is about me, right? To be introduced by Jim, one of my mentors at HL7, and to have the opportunity to introduce Keith, another long-term mentor. I was long ago, I was given the opportunity to write a piece of code to load the VA NDFRT terminology into a set of tools that Keith had developed. And the only way to really learn how to do that at the time, efficiently, effectively, was to learn from Keith directly. And I was given the opportunity to literally be welcomed into his home with Susan and learn from him and soak up as much as I could in a week's worth of time and write code to load that terminology. And I believe Brian was there also, bringing it all together. See, I told you I would get there. As Brian's talk was yesterday morning. To bring this all together, I shamelessly borrow from the inaugural lecture given in 2011, the first James Reed Memorial Lecture. And so I quote, James Reed was a perfectionist. He strove for excellence in everything he did, changing the world he lived in. One of James's favorite quotes comes from George Bernard Shaw. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress in the world depends on the unreasonable man. With that, please welcome this year's Reed Memorial Lecture presenter, an unreasonable in the best ways possible man, and one of this year's SNOMED Lifetime Achievement Award recipients, Dr. Keith Campbell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. I think this will be fun. We'll see. Well, first of all, welcome. And thank you all for choosing to invest your time this morning with me. I'm honored to be invited to give the James Reed Memorial Lecture this year. And, as many of you have heard, I've had a long journey supporting SNOMED over its lifetime, including the integration of SNOMED RT with the NHS clinical terms in order to form SNOMED CT. So what I want to do is describe what kind of motivated it. Why did we do this in the first place? What motivated development of SNOMED RT and then the integration of this with the NHS clinical terms, and the development approach we used to implement this, to foreshadow where I think we need to be going, which is what I've coined as integrated knowledge management. And what can this look like in the future? And how can this, and you know, we have an example of a successful large-scale collaboration. So first I want to get to this crisis of confidence. I put this in the title. It was deliberately a bit edgy, if you will. Why don't we have the confidence that health IT is going to improve clinical practice and result in better individual and public health? Well, poor data quality is everywhere we look, right? And the clinicians are overwhelmed. We lack a broad scientific foundation for how we deal with interoperability between systems and similar. And without an ability to contribute, we need a scientific foundation that allows the end users to be able to contribute to their circumstance, to be able to build on their environment to make it work better for them and work better for their patients. Without that foundation, we have frustration, and this directly leads to a crisis of confidence. We have challenges with physicians wanting to leave practice because, you know, their frustrations with EHRs, alert fatigue, other similar things. So let's move on. Let me tell you about two historic crises. So there were two historic crises that led, they were intertwined, and they led to the formation of SNOMED RT, right? And they also played the foundation for the organization that is here today. And it's been an amazing journey. The first crisis was a personal one. So in the 1980s, I chose to become a physician, go to medical school. And I chose that because, you know, medicine is an honorable profession that depends on the rigorous application of science, and those things appealed to me. But a challenge came during my first year in medical school. There was a report that had just been released called Physicians for the 21st Century. And it talked about this overwhelming amount of information that was being learned, and that it was a challenge for people to assimilate and to incorporate that into their practice. And it promised, you know, this volume of information promised to make practicing a general field, you know, internal medicine, family practice, obstetrics and gynecology, something that's a broad range of medicine, it promised to make it unsafe. And I was worried that I couldn't practice medicine in a way that I could make it through my career and look back and say, you know, I practiced and I didn't kill someone as having through a mistake on my own, right? And so the solution that people were promoting at the time was that there was this specialization, there was this push to specialization. And so as an example, instead of becoming a general ophthalmologist, you would become a left upper eyelid specialist, because the amount of information you need to learn in order to manage the left upper eyelid was manageable. But if you tried to manage the whole person, it was too difficult. And so this trend towards narrow specialization led to a concern that healthcare would become more fractionated, more expensive, and lower quality. And so I was concerned by my inability to assimilate this much information and to be prevented from safely practicing medicine. And so I sought a different. I wondered if applying computers to healthcare and would help with these knowledge management challenges and allow me to practice safely. And not just me, that I was trying to put myself in the role of the generalist. How can we make clinical practice work for generalists so that we can provide the continuity of care and not lead to the overspecialization and the fragmentation of care. So I enrolled at an elective called Computers in Clinical Medicine at the National Institute of Health. And what personally committed then that after I finished my medical training, I would enroll in a medical informatics program to then, further that. And although I embarked on this journey with a goal of supporting general practice, I recognize I have now become the informatics equivalent of a left upper eyelid specialist, right? And I don't know how many people here have had this challenge when well-meaning in-laws say, well, what do you do for a living, right? And well, it's like, well, okay, I work in computers and medicine, this and trying to explain SNOMED just doesn't work. So that's a little bit of irony. The second crisis was an existential one for Kaiser Permanente, the largest health maintenance organization in the United States. They had lost membership for the first time in their history. There was new competition in the market. Other groups were saying, oh, there's a segment here that we're not competing in. And as a result, they were being pushed to compare, by the purchasers, specifically a group like the California Public Employees Retirement System, which is the largest outside the federal government of purchaser of healthcare in the US. They were being pushed to just base decisions on how much it cost. What was the premium? What was the premium per? And they say, well, if your rates aren't the lowest anymore, so why should we even offer you? And Kaiser had a firm belief in their model that led to better outcomes. In fact, they actually could show they had adverse selection. What adverse selection means is that if somebody would come up with a chronic disease, like I got diabetes, they would say, oh, I need to go enroll in Kaiser Permanente because I won't have to pay every visit and it will be more manageable and more affordable. So they would get actually the sickest patients. And so as a result, they wanted to be able to compare the quality of care they provided, not just the cost of the care, but the quality of care they provided with other groups. And so in order to do that, they needed a standard for representing clinical data that would be shared and be acceptable, that their competitors would also use and so they recognized that they needed to have not a private representation, but they needed to contribute to a publicly available representation of clinical data. And then I went on to my informatics training at Stanford, and there were these 4 projects within the lab. They were high-profile projects getting written up. Mycin was the very first one. It showed that it could use a rules-based expert system to provide antibiotic selection at higher quality than most healthcare professionals, and equivalent to an infectious disease fellow, right? The evaluations of the system were all stellar. But it wasn't used. And well, why wasn't it used? And the problem was the data in Mycin and the data in Oncocin and the data in QMRDT and the data in T helper were all different and independent, and they wouldn't interoperate with each other, even though they were from the same lab with many of the same principal investigators, with many of the same developers. So again, Mycin was the first one, and they recognized, they did a study, why wasn't it acceptable for people to use this in practice? And the burden of data entry was just too large, that it just wouldn't fit in within a clinical workflow. And because it had a question answer response paradigm, and everything had to be re-entered, and it was just unrealistic. It would be easier to call the infectious disease fellow directly and say, what should I prescribe for my patient? So despite this knowledge for the system, they didn't share this representation. And I asked the people, why is this the case? Why aren't you able to work with the representation of the others? And they said, it's just too difficult to integrate. And so essentially, and this is the point I got back then, it was easier to reinvent the wheel than to build on the work of others. And so I saw that as the fundamental challenge. And so I chose to then work on computer-supported collaborative work, and this is where it converged. That I wanted to work on methods that would make it easier to build on the work of others than it is to reinvent the wheel, so that we can then, advance interoperability, advance application capabilities. So I published a paper on this preliminary work. It was called A Logical Foundation for Representing Clinical Data. And then Roger Cote, who was then editor-in-chief of SNOMED International, read the paper and invited me to join the SNOMED editorial group. And also John Madison from Kaiser Permanente read the paper, and he said, can this be a solution to our need for a standardized representation of clinical data that needed something that was better, more granular than the administrative data sets? ICD and CPT would not do the kind of benchmarking they felt we needed. And so that then led to this convergence, where we were able to bring together this convergence of ideas, a desire to build on the work of others, a desire to share this capability, to then create a project to work on SNOMED RT between the Kaiser Permanente and the College of American Pathologists. And how did we do this? So this wasn't done before. It was kind of the first time, and it was fairly large scale that we needed to do this work. And so a challenge is that in order to be useful, the terminology that we use to encode patient data needs to be understood by all of the participants in the care process. So we had to figure out, how do we do this in a way that, in fact, the data that results on the other end is an accurate reflection of the patient's conditions, right? So that we can then compare apples to apples. And so we thought we'd rely on the wisdom of the crowds. And so it's a technique where you aggregate information in groups, and then you pull that information together, distill it into a way that meets your specific needs. And there's some requirements to build on the wisdom of crowds. And so one of them is diversity of opinion, right? That each person should come in with their own information and their own background, and bring that to the table as part of the work, the participation, the wisdom of the crowd. We need independence, right? If it's a matter of somebody says something and they're very lauded, and everybody in the room says, oh yes, of course, we agree with you. That's not going to get the wisdom of the crowd, right? We need to figure out how to get the wisdom of the crowd. Decentralization. We know that we want a group that can draw on a large corpus of specialized knowledge across different perspectives and backgrounds. And then aggregation. We need some process by which we can collect that data in a useful way that takes us further towards our goal, and does it in a way that is of high quality and statistically provable, provably so. And then finally, trust, right? There has to be the trust that all of the participants in this process feel that they can be heard and be represented. And so how did we do this with regards to the development of SNOMED RT? Well, so we ensured the diversity of the participants. We made sure that we had nurses participating with physicians. This wasn't just a physician project or a nurse project, and we had ophthalmologists and different specialists and internists. And that diversity of opinion is essential, because that diversity of opinion reflects the diversity of providers in healthcare. And if we don't have that diversity, we can't create the general capability that we need. Independence. We gave duplicate assignments to different people, and we required that they keep those assignments private until they were completed, right? So there would be independence of thought with regards to what was created. It was decentralized. We ensured participation of clinicians from different centers across different regions of the United States. And of course, today, you're getting participation across different countries and different languages and similar. So this decentralization was important. Aggregation. We had to develop a specific tool set that would enable us to ask structured questions of these participants, allow them to answer it within their private assignments, and then take the results of that work and feed it back into the process. So that that was, we have to have the technology that supports this at scale. So in order to have wisdom of the crowds, you have to be able to work with a large crowd in order to do that. And finally, trust. We created a transparent process that everyone's work is openly shared at the right time. We make sure that it's private up until it's so that one person's work is not influencing the work of another. But once you've completed your work, you take the cover off and everybody talks about it and works on it. And so here's a specific example. And this was one we actually have a transcript of this whole interaction. And this transcript, this is a very small excerpt from this transcript. And it's for one of the early concepts they were looking at was flexion. And so they started with a general definition that in SNOMED International, flexion was categorized in the musculoskeletal symptom chapter. And then we asked two people to independently say, how would you improve this definition? Would you leave it this way or would you make something different? And as part of improvement, they could see all of the content that was already within SNOMED RT. So we assigned them independently to these different modelers. Their goal was to research and define flexion with greater specificity. And so they did. So modeler one went on and they said, oh, I think flexion should be described as a muscle function. And modeler two went on and said, oh, I think flexion should be described as a joint function, right? And so this then we presented to them. This is part of the transparency. They're able to now see the work of each other. The tooling has focused disagreement because if they agreed, we just sent it on, said, thank you very much, next. And then we focus on where, because people talk. I mean, good grief. We found that if we allowed people to talk about what they agreed about, like, oh yeah, I like that. In an hour session, they would spend 45 minutes talking about the things they agreed about and essentially no time spending it focused on where they're disagreeing. So the focused disagreement was critical. And so then using these principles, diversity of opinion, independence, and decentralization, they did this work. And so here's some of the transcript. So there was a moderator, I guess that was me. Yes, there was a moderator that was in this process saying, okay, we've got you all together. We had three modelers that, the two that had actually done the work and another one that was participating in the process, and said, okay, we're going to focus on figure one now. And modeler three, now having seen the work of the other one, sort of said, pay no attention to that. It really is a muscle function. So he's doubling down. He's saying, I saw that work over there, but you don't get it. And then modeler one says, well, excuse me, the joint is the thing that moves. So how can you not say it's a joint function, right? So now both of these folks had seen the other person's work, right? But we said you can't come out of the room until you reach agreement, okay? And so then I pointed out, I said, well, there's this thing called isometric exercise where you don't actually move anything. So, maybe think about that as you're thinking about how this works. And then said, modeler two then says, well, flexion requires an activity of a flexor, right? And then Mahler, no, wait. It does not require a flexor. Well, and remember that this is general and it distinguishes, and it doesn't distinguish between active flexion and passive flexion, right? And then Mahler 3, well, of course, that's what I said. And it could be intrinsic or extrinsic. So it could be that an examiner would move your joint to see, can I flex this joint, as opposed to, can you flex your joint with your muscles? And so, and then someone's saying, well, should we take the third option here and make it the muscle function as a point? And then Mahler 1 says, aha, well, what if we added a concept to the terminology called active flexion? Right. And so now we're starting to tap into the wisdom of the crowd. And then, yes, active flexion has a joint that is flexed, and you could also have the muscle group performing it, and then there's passive flexion, and then on it goes. And so, aha, we will now have two parents. And so the point here is that if we had gone through certain types of processes, we would have ended up with one person said this, the other person said that. We didn't allow them to talk to each other. Somebody would decide which of the two was right, but neither of the two answers was really as good as it could have been. And by providing them with an opportunity to work on focused disagreement, they were able to do better work than they would have individually, and that the quality of the terminology and of the representation would grow as a result. And so the final hierarchy, they said, aha, we need to add a term called active flexion. Active flexion has to involve a joint function and a muscle function. And oh, by the way, there's this thing called passive flexion. And that with these together, we're able to now then get the richer terminology. And this was the foundational process that we used for the development of SNOMED RT. This feeds into something that Mickey at his keynote gave a little mention at a slide where he said there was this "to err is human" report. And well, actually, we haven't really made a lot of progress there over the days. But this is part of trying to say, how can we create a highly reliable process? And that's what the "to err to human" report was about. How do we bring highly reliable processes, disciplines into healthcare? This was trying to bring highly reliable process disciplines into the process by which we manage how we encode data within healthcare. And here is a graph of the, so for this particular work, we did it over around 20,000 concepts. And this is the number of rounds it took. So we had this process by which we would give them in groups of 100, and they were allowed to talk to each other for the first 10. Right, so for the first 10, we'd say, oh, here's a something. And they were supposed to write down their agreement about how they would model it. So this then became a self-describing process as well, that the modeler style guide would come as a result of this process. They would have a written agreement. They would go through 10 concepts, and then they would try to do the other 90 independently. They could rely on any medical information source they wanted, but they were supposed to adhere to the principles that they had agreed to about how to model this content. And so basically we found that there was a halving with each round. So they'd go through the first round, they'd review the 10, they'd do the 90, they agreed about 50% of the time. And so then we would then take it into groups of 100 again. And then they would look at the first 10, they would talk with each other, they would update their guidance, and then they would try to use that guidance to finish the rest of it and equivalent. And so we found that basically for every chapter, it basically took 5 iterations. It was a fairly reproducible process that basically halved with each round. And out the other end, we would get a terminology that was self-describing and had the rigor of any term that went in had to have been agreed to independently by 2 people without sort of saying, oh, this was done by Kent Spackman, so yes, oh my God, it must be right. You know, it would be this work of independence. And so the result of this is the Kaiser Permanente Convergent Medical Terminology Project, which provided the foundation for SNOMED RT, which is still ongoing today. And that provided the foundation for SNOMED CT, along with, the NHS clinical terms was also a large body of work. And I'm sure they have many stories similar to this about how they developed SNOMED CT. So clinical terms. So, the merger was definitely a merger of equals. So one of the things about crises is that crises often incentivize new cooperative behaviors and systems, right? And so SNOMED RT and SNOMED CT are an example of, again, I'm tracing this to my crisis of confidence for being able to take care of patients in a safe way. Kaiser's crisis of confidence that they needed to be able to they need to be able to compare the quality of the care they provided with competitors, and how would we provide a means to do that, and that caused them to cooperate and invest. And the British National Health Service said at some point it got to the point where, well, this SNOMED thing over here is looking pretty good, and also our clinical terms thing over here is looking pretty good, and if we end up just competing and fighting with each other, that ends up sort of being a lose-lose, right? So why don't we work together and try to create a integrated solution so that it's a win-win, right? And then that's the formation of SNOMED clinical terms. So as a result, SNOMED CT exists, this organization exists. However, our work is not done. That we have new challenges for new crises, right? And COVID created a worldwide crisis that really exposed some of our areas of weaknesses with regards to how we manage data, how we collect data, and the quality of that data. So I propose that we need to just take these same steps. How do we need to go from crisis of confidence to confidence. How do we get to a point where we're confident in our ability to quickly collect the data that we need to be responsive to the challenges of the moment? When loss of taste and smell becomes discovered, how do we get it quickly into the questionnaires? And I want to tell a little story on this one. And shout out to Scott Campbell. I don't think he's here in person, but he may be on the video. Oh, you are here in person. So awesome. During the COVID crisis, we had a problem with test reagents, right? We didn't have enough to be able to do every test that needed to be done. And so you would triage who got tests, and then you would also do something that would be to pool tests. So you'd say, okay, we don't have enough reagents, so I'll pool 10 samples in one pool. And if that sample, if any one of those is positive, it'll make the whole pool positive, and then you have to split that apart and then individually repeat the test for all 10. And so the knowledge that was learned that loss of taste and smell is like 80% predictive of a positive COVID test. Scott made use of that in his public health lab to make sure that the people that came in were pre-screened, and anybody that said yes to those symptoms was not put in the pool because they were tested independently, and then that saved reagent and allowed a broader testing as a result, allowed more people to be tested with the same amount of reagents that wouldn't otherwise be there. And I think that's a really nice example of how we can apply and be prepared if we have the ability to quickly say, there's something new. We need to be able to add new content to the terminology quickly. We need to get that content now into questionnaires that are electronic quickly, and then get those questionnaires out into the field where they can be used in the care of the patients, and then get the data that comes back from that and say, are we doing the right thing? And do we need to change? Is there new data that we need to collect? So to do this, we need to build on the work of others, right? And we need to rely on the wisdom of the crowds. And we need to do it all in a way that is based on high reliability organization principles, so that it can be done in a way that we know is safe, right? That there won't be unintended things because we just weren't paying attention, that we've worked to make sure that the work is has the foundational metrics that we need to assure that it's fit for purpose for what we're trying to accomplish. So as an example, CDC has CVX codes, the vaccine codes. Certainly, there was a lot of change going on. We've got experimental vaccines that are going out. How do we manage that code set? The National Library of Medicine also has the RX norm codes, right? And there's also some vaccines in the RX norm codes too. And but RX norm and CVX codes aren't the same. They come with different formats, different release cycles, different processes for managing and maintaining them. And then at the FDA, where I am now, we have the national drug codes, right? And so we've got the NDC codes, the CVX codes, and the RX norm codes. And they're not building on the work of each other, right? And we're not utilizing the wisdom of the crowd because CDC is working to manage CDC codes within CDC spaces, and NLM is working to manage RX norm within RX norm spaces, and FDA is working to manage NDC codes within. So we need to build on the power of the crowd. We need to bring those three groups together. And, that is very much a motivation as to why SNOMED has the SNOMED International Drug Model, right? And the SNOMED International Drug Model, in part, was built on the work of the British DM&D dictionary. I can't remember whether it's devices, the medicines, and or is it? No, it's dictionary of drugs, medicines, and devices. So, did I get that right? And then the Australian medicines terminology. That by bringing them together, we now are to a point where there's better integration, there's better wisdom of the crowds. There were people that were debating, how should this content be represented? And it wasn't just an Australian problem or a British problem, it was more of a shared problem where we're bringing together the crowd, if you will, to try to make sure that that works best. So we need to do this in a way that we build on each other's work. Now, what happens if it doesn't go well? And so, I'll pick on my own organization here a little bit. The Veterans Administration has the electronic health record. It was, definitely a leader at the time when it first came out, widely deployed at, over 1,500 medical centers using it. But because they couldn't manage at scale and didn't have sort of the commitment to managing it collaboratively, it resulted that there's 130 different versions of Vista across the system. And as we're trying to migrate from Vista to Cerner, that creates all kinds of complications because the data representation at one site is not the same as the data representation at another site. And we can't implement national decision support because we can't roll out a rule nationally because there's 130 different regions that interpret that rule differently. So we can do better. We can do better. So we want to have integrated knowledge management and move forward by saying, how can we become more integrated? How can we enable the creation of integrated content? How can we enable RX norm, CDC, NDC, British DM&D, Australian medicines terminology, SNOMED International Drug Model? How can we bring all of those things together so that we have independence of thought, shared perspective, common purpose, and tooling that helps us bring those all together into an effective collaboration? And then ensure the proper management of our integrated knowledge over time. And integrated knowledge, to me, is more than just the terminology. we need to be developing, during COVID, we had to develop business process models for the how we managed COVID and what we call the COVID tent. And we wanted to share those models. And so it's not just collaborative management of the terminology, it's collaborative management of the processes that you put on top of that terminology and get us to the point where we can have national decision support, that a decision support vendor could in fact create a product that would then be usable across a Cerner system, an Epic system, a Vista system, and other systems. And today that really can't happen. So where we are today, so to recap, the volume of medical knowledge continues to expand at a rate beyond all previous human experience. Healthcare providers are passive recipients of content that do not and cannot meet their needs. Alert fatigue, again, is a very common thing, and physician burnout and other providers as well. It's not just a physician challenge. COVID-19 has demonstrated a very significant weakness in our healthcare data infrastructure. And we want to, the applying computers to the knowledge management is still an unmet need. That we still have work to do to try to enable the promises of health IT that have been given, for at least 20 years, right? So these issues can't be solved alone. We must come together and work towards integrated knowledge management solutions. And so there are my call to action. How do we achieve this? There are several things that we can do. One is that we need to break down the silos, right? We can't afford, from many perspectives, financially, intellectually, but in order to effectively respond to a public health emergency, these silos have to be broken down so that we can work together in a better way. We need to empower the clinicians, that they need to be moved from being sort of passive recipients of alert fatigue and billing coding to transform that experience into something that is more meaningful and to harness them. I mean, that's a huge crowd. How do we harness the power of that crowd to advance our medical knowledge, to improve our resilience, and make us prepared so that we are going from crisis to confidence. We want to be in a position where we have confidence. We need to empower the public, because more and more public are having the ability to have smartphone apps and have direct input, into their healthcare decisions as well, and to contribute their information to this body of knowledge that is used for caring for them, but also used for making what are the best ways of caring for patients. And then we need to enlist the technology sector to make sure that we get capable knowledge management environments and interoperability of these knowledge management environments. So even if you have a choice of knowledge management, you still have an ability to participate in the same crowd that other groups are doing. I think I had a story yesterday about a woman that needed to get an MRI transferred from one group to another kind of urgently, and it was both. And at both sites, they were using the same the same commercial health record system, but yet they couldn't electronically get the images sent, and so they had to hop in a car and drive over and get a CD, and then, we need to do better. And then we need to provide collaborative tools. How do we help people work together? How do we help people build this knowledge management capability? So our path forward. I propose that we look to how it was done in the past, that just like we did for SNOMED RT, that we tap the power of the crowds, that we work in collaborative settings, that we ensure that there is great diversity, inclusion, and trust in the process, but that it has to be supported with rigor and appropriate tooling that helps make sure that we have high quality and that we actually measure the quality of the work that comes out. And so my plea to you is, please join us, right? So thank you.
Have a seat. So now we have an opportunity to open up a period of questions. I would like to start with one if I could.
Okay.
So very inspiring to get things together, to put essentially a framework upon which we can start to build this. We've talked about interoperability for decades.
Yes.
In this. And so those who are skeptics would look at what you're saying today and say, how do you avoid another interoperability initiative fatigue?
Interoperability fatigue is absolutely real, right? And there's a number, I don't think there's any one way of dealing with it, but I think one of the big important transitions that we need to make is that we have to incentivize interoperability by focusing on quality of data, right? You know, that it's not enough just to say, I can connect A and B, and A and B sends data that B can't understand, and A sends data that B can't understand. You know, we have to do better than that. And that has to be incentivized, right? And so interoperability, I propose, is really a proxy for quality of data, right? And so if we set a set of standards that say, in order for data, like for lab data, in order for COVID data, you know, the COVID test data, in order for COVID test data to be quality, it has to have a sample. It has to have a unique device identifier for the device that the test came from. It has to have a location as to where the sample was taken. And if you look at it through that quality lens, that will bring you interoperability as well, because the quality metrics that you're going to start looking at will be the required fields. And if we're actually then saying that we expect reproducibility in the population of this field and consistency in this field, and we will pay you for it if you meet those quality, then it stops being an academic debate and it becomes a financial necessity. And I think that's a focus as to how we get to better interoperability.
So do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you, Keith. Great talk. The thing I'm thinking is the community crowd process takes some time.
Yeah.
Because you need to get these people in a room and talk about all this. But then in a situation like COVID, you need to respond quickly. And I'm just sort of wondering what your perspective is on how to do both of those at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why we have to have our tools and processes figured out up front, right? You know, so during COVID, as an example, we didn't have it figured out how we would do a coordinated release process on a weekly basis across RxNorm and LOINC and SNOMED. And people were, you know, everybody was working hard, and, you know, you could go to the British National Health Service website and they would say, here's a list of all of the new codes that we've added. And so people were out there scraping websites and, you know, manually bringing those things into their own systems. And, you know, I think an example of the type of resilience we need to build there is, you know, the work that Cyro has done with OntoServer. You know, the idea that we would have a national ability to integrate content and then syndicate them out. So that deals, I think, with part of your question. I think the other part of your question is dealing with the human dimension. But I also think that there's an equivalent part of that answer, is that if we have our collaborative processes figured out, well-tooled, get it efficient, then one of the things that we can do is we can choose who's in the room. We still want independence and diversity, but we might want to make sure that the people that are in the room are at the top of their game, right? And that they, you know, they have an urgency to understand that we need to give them the information as quickly as we can so that they can rise to the occasion. So I think you know, one of my big lessons, well, many of you in this room would have predicted the challenges that we had in COVID, is that we have to be prepared and we have to have practiced it. And as an example, some of the things that we're trying to do within the project I run, SHIELD at the FDA, is we're trying to do HL7 connect-a-thons that take a scenario of emerging acute and chronic infectious disease and do exactly this process. Okay, well, we need to come up with some new data element. Okay, well, how do we add that data element? That data element then needs to go into a form so that it can be collected. How do we get that form authored and get it pushed out? The data then that's collected needs to be normalized so that it can be represented. How can we make sure that this cycle is machined and efficient? That's the call to action. So,
Kelly, do we have any online questions?
We do. We have one online question here. Keith, excellent presentation. As a newbie clinical informatician, I'd love to know what your favorite part of working in medical informatics is and working with SNOMED.
Well, there's this intellectual challenge, right? In that, how can we look at where we are and make things better in a rigorous way within the domain that we're working on? And so, in some regards, that example of flexion is trivial. The idea that they went through a process and they came up with active flexion and passive flexion, and most clinicians would say, duh, I learned that, long time ago. But to get the processes in place that can be sustaining, right? So I think that's kind of what drives me. It's not I modeled this concept today. It's that I've worked to create this process by which, when we follow this process, we can have tremendous productivity and quality that can have a direct impact, right? And although there certainly was challenges with COVID, there were also successes as well, and again, I'll call out Scott Campbell. That was an example of just a brilliant application of, informatics to a real need, where he made use of understanding, of the domain, the importance of encoding the data, and made a difference. And so the ability to make a difference is why I went into informatics.
Keith, thank you as always for a thought-provoking discussion. And I have a question for you, though. From your final sentence, who is us? Please join us. In all of the processes you identified, there was always a convener. Kaiser
Right.
Permanente, creates the sphere of trust.
Yes.
Okay. And so, in your experience, this has been a sort of a walking up the steps, I guess. So what do you see as the next step?
Well, I think there's a series of who us is, right? And I think one of the us is SNOMED International, right? My goal for SNOMED, or my request for SNOMED, is that it reinvigorate towards a collaborative meritocracy, right? And that's a mouthful, but collaboration is messy, right? It's often easier to just shut the door and say, oh yeah, we're going to focus on getting these things done, and we're not going to. When SNOMED was when the IHTS deal was conceived, there was an expectation that a lot of the work would be done more by the release centers than would be done by the central group, and that the central group would be doing more coordination. And there's challenges with that model, but there's also challenges with the centralized model as well, saying, oh yeah, well, we'll just pay the central authority to then do this work for us. We need to blend that properly. And that's an ongoing balance. It's not that anything's broken, but it's also not necessarily that it's optimal. How do we balance that correctly? When at the Veterans Administration, as Catherine Hong knows, we have said we want to contribute. We want to have a VA extension and contribute that. And there's like, oh, but you're the VA. You're not a release center. You're not a release center. How can you create an extension? Well, actually, we're the largest healthcare provider in the United States. Well, why can't we have an extension? Those kind of dynamics. How do we make it a collaborative meritocracy? And then there's going to be many us's. So one of the other us's that we met with yesterday would be the federal space within the US, that we need an us that says, can we have integration across CDC and the Office of the National Coordinator and CMS and the Veterans Health Administration? Can we bring that us together? And so then, and can we have the ability to have all of these different us's collaborate within a common foundation for knowledge management so that we can build on the work of each other? So that was a long answer, that there's not one us, right? And that depending upon who's convening and what your needs are, there's going to be a natural formation of us's. And the challenge is not to allow the us's to become silos.
Do we have time for one more question?
Do we?
Go ahead, Charles.
Thank you very much for a very good talk. The world's attention at the moment is on the magic of artificial intelligence, either
Yes.
true or apparent. Is there a positive tension between that and the hard graft of making interoperability work?
I believe there is. So artificial intelligence or, the tooling, machine learning or other things, what they do is they're a magnifier, right? And if the information put in has mistakes, they will magnify those mistakes and you will have mistakes at scale, right? If what you put into them is of quality and of value, they will magnify that quality and value. So they are not a replacement for each other. The computer-based capabilities are amplifiers for the quality that we create as the foundation. And so will AI make terminology irrelevant? No, it won't. It actually makes the quality of that more important. And it also makes the investment in that more important because it's going to impact a larger scale and it becomes more critical rather than less critical.
Thank you, Keith.
Right.
Let's please thank him one more time. So I'd like to invite Diane Babsky up now for a few final comments.
Sorry about that. Good morning. Did that wake you up? Anyway, I don't want to get between you and your coffee break, but I did want to, first of all, thank Keith again for being the Reed Lecture. So another round. And congratulations again on the Lifetime Achievement. This is the reason why. So great work. I also want to thank my NLM folks. Show of hands, thank you for all of the hard work. It took a year of planning with the SNOMED team. So a round of applause for everyone. And then I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. I hope you've had a moment to enjoy some of the Southern hospitality of Atlanta. And if not, maybe you'll get some this afternoon. Thank you.